Some of you knew my father-in-law, Jerry. He spent toward the end of his life, he was here. He was he was the guy in the little red scooter that would come down the hallway. Do you remember he used to have that walker thing he would sit in, and he would come backward down the hallway? You just had to get out of his way if he was coming. He wasn't looking. But when I was dating his daughter, he was the preacher at the church in North Enid, and he was one of those guys that likes to have his desk just so. You know, the staplers at this, 45-degree angle and this little deal. Everything's just so. And so one of my favorite things to do was to walk into the church building, kind of look around, and then just walk over to his desk and just adjust something slightly. Not a lot. I didn't want to break anything or ruin anything, but just mess it up. And I evidently did it often enough that anytime anything was messed up, he started blaming me, whether or not it was my fault. But there was something about that, settled perfection that I had this weird inclination to come in and just mess up. I know some of you are like, yeah, that sounds like you. I would never do something like that. But I actually think there's a human instinct there. Sometimes when we're not feeling right, when we're a little dysregulated, when we're a little frustrated, a little upset, and we see somebody else, everything looks smooth for them, we want to come in and we just want to mess it up a little bit. Like, for example, if you've ever been at a stoplight, the light turns green, the person behind you honks. How many of you have sat there just a beat longer to show them who's boss? They may have a pregnant woman in the back seat, and they're like, we got to get to the hospital. And you're like, no, on my time, buddy. There's just something about us that just, when things are too perfect, we somehow like to mess it up. And there's this principle. In fact, we've been defining this Hebrew word every single week, this same word, shalom. Should be on your screen. There we go. Shalom. And it's this idea where God wanted to create beauty and perfection and wholeness and meaning, and he created a world where that existed. And then humans evidently were just feeling a little feisty that morning and said, we are going to introduce some brokenness to this. And we've just been doing it ever since. We took what God created and we just messed it up a little bit. We just broke it. Humans came along and broke it. But the good news is, and what we've been talking about in this series, and this is the last in this series, is that we broke it, but we can help restore it because God's on a mission of restoring shalom. So we've talked about this many weeks ago, and some of you aren't going to remember this, but we talked about the illustration of this giant landfill known as the murder capital of the world, and people came along and they turned it into a garden. It's no longer remembered for this, it's remembered for this. Or we talked about how we can look at homelessness and we can be so frustrated and upset, and why doesn't somebody do something, or why don't they get a job? Or you can be like my parents' friend and you can make pancakes for people who are homeless. Like, you can curse the darkness or you can light a candle. We can restore God's goodness and beauty and wholeness. We have the opportunity to do that. And that's inspiring. It's exciting to me to think like God has given me and he's given you the capacity to absorb insult and return goodness and grace. He's given me the capacity to bypass revenge and offer forgiveness. He's given us that. It's a wonderful, incredible thing. But have you noticed this phenomenon? When you try to get it together, it seems like things start to fall apart. Have you ever had this? I am going to get on top of this debt. I'm going to get control of this spending. I'm going to make sure that I have a budget. And then your check engine light comes on. And you're like, oh, that's going to be expensive. I'm going to start exercising more. I'm going to get into shape. I'm going to go to church and they serve donuts. And you're like, well, the temptation. I'm going to be more punctual. I hate the fact that I procrastinate. And then your alarm doesn't go off. Well, there's this phenomenon, when we try to get it together, it seems like things start to dissipate and disintegrate and fall apart. I think it's fair to say that we live in an age of anxiety. We live in an age of anxiety. There's countless reports. Just like every single news outlet talks about the fact that mental illness rates are skyrocketing, particularly among young people. And it just feels like the diagnoses are way up. And that all seems right. But I do think about the fact that when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, I don't know that anybody was asking. I don't know if it's worse or if we just didn't know. I don't know if it's bad now or the people that we called nervous Nellies back in the day actually maybe had a medical diagnosis and they needed some help. But we're just like, whatever, that person's got to get it together. But I do think we live in an age of anxiety, and we kind of think that today is worse than ever, but I'm not entirely sure that's true. Do you recognize this emoji right here? Anybody? Anybody? I use this one to convey like embarrassment, like shock. That's what I use it for. I don't know. Anybody else, what do you use it for? Do you ever use it? It's one. A ghost. You use it for a ghost. So when you're texting somebody and you're like, you should be scared. Yeah. Anybody else? What do you use it for? Probably nobody uses it for its intended meaning. This emoji was inspired by a work of art that you're familiar with. Edward Munch, he painted the Scream. You remember that? Yeah, the Scream. And this was in 1893, so this has been a little while back, before the medical diagnoses of anxiety today. And this is his quote from painting this. He's painted it several times, but this is the experience he was trying to convey. He said he was standing there on this boardwalk, trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. And according to the artist, he wasn't screaming, he was trying to block it out. He's got his fingers in his ears because he wants to block out the anxiety and the frustration of life. So evidently, in 1893, there was a lot of anxiety in the world too. It's not just today. It happened over 100 years ago. In fact, if you back up a couple thousand years, you go all the way back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, where Jesus spoke, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry." Some of your translations use the word, "do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is life not more than food, and the body not more than clothes?" Now, we be careful here, because some of you immediately had this reaction. You're like, oh, hold on, Patrick. We cannot conflate common worry with a diagnosis of anxiety, a generalized anxiety disorder. We can't conflate those two things, and I think that's absolutely right. I don't want to imply they're the same, and I don't want to imply that they have similar solutions. Just stop having general anxiety disorder. But they both disrupt shalom. They both make it difficult for us to experience peace. By the way, have I told you that the way we translate the word shalom in English in the New Testament is by using the word peace? It's the most common translation of it. Do not worry in this passage literally means do not take up other thoughts. Matthew chapter 6, verse 32, Jesus bookends this section by saying, "For the pagans run after these things. Your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Seek first," you know this passage, "seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be given to you as well." Sounds so simple. Seek first. Just focus on Jesus. Just focus on the one thing that God has told us to focus on. Seek first his kingdom. And imagine this represents the things that most matter in life. The good things in life that God has given us, whether it be our families or our jobs or our faith, that we're supposed to focus on this and not get distracted from this and make sure that we're taking care of this. But the problem is life. Life comes along, and then even when you're a kid, right? You're a kid, I'm going to a new school. And then what if the other kids at school don't like me? And what if my hair doesn't look good at school? And then you get to middle school, and that's a real problem. Middle school, that's pretty tough to focus on the right things in middle school, and I don't know where the classes are, and my teachers, and there's a cute girl. Oh. I really like her. I guess I better start taking showers every day. I better start making myself look good. And then I got to think about good grades, because my parents are on to me about good grades, and I have to make sure I get into a good college somewhere. And this good college, I hope that I have people I like, and I hope I like my professors. And I think that, marriage? This is the one? Oh, well, how do we work this out? Man, I got to make sure that I'm getting the right thing for Valentine's Day, and I don't want to forget her birthday, and I don't want to forget that 3-month anniversary, and proposing, and oh man, sometimes life throws curveballs at us, and then we've got to fix it, and then all of a sudden we're married, and then we're having a kid, and am I going to be a good dad? Am I going to be a good mom? What about work? Oh, we got to get a bigger house and retirement. And it's nowhere along the way did you want to forget about the most important things in life. But all of a sudden, you're there holding armfuls of life, and you're thinking, where did it go? Where did it go? Steve, you want to hand it? There we go. Where did it go? And it wasn't anything bad. It wasn't like we woke up one morning and we said, I'm not going to focus on God. I'm not going to focus on Jesus. I'm not going to care about my spiritual walk. It's just life kept coming at us. And then all of a sudden we're thinking about retirement, and we're thinking about legacy, and we're thinking about our grandkids. It's just life. Nowhere did we say, I'm not going to seek God first anymore. We just took up all these other thoughts. That's literally what the verse says. Do not take up all those other thoughts. But that's what we did. And somewhere along the way, we lost track of what we were supposed to focus on. Forget bringing shalom into the world. Forget introducing forgiveness and taking out revenge. We don't experience peace and shalom in our own lives. How do we get shalom? How do we get peace in an age of anxiety? And the tough news is that it's always really been an age of anxiety. You want it to get together, things fall apart. I've seen a couple halftime shows at Timberwolves games, and usually when you start, people are sort of disinterested, but as the show goes on, people gain more and more interest, more and more attention. And these two particular ones, I've seen this lady eventually somehow, I don't know how you discover you're good at this kind of stuff. How do you discover you're good at kicking bowls from your foot, balancing them on your head while you're riding a 7-foot unicycle? Just one day, you're like, I'm going to give this a shot. We're going to see what happens here. I don't know. And then this guy with the balancing on the chairs. I mean, I'm sure he was doing that at his home, and I'm sure he was driving his mom absolutely crazy. See, our solution for peace in an age of anxiety is to attempt to control and balance and arrange and organize everything perfectly. That's our goal. We must have a steady paycheck. We must have good grades. We must have folded laundry and a clean house. Everyone must like me. I must not be missing out. My kids are in every sport and look good in every sport. I look good online. I hold the correct opinions. And if I can arrange and balance everything just so, then I can have peace. Then I can have shalom. What happens if that's your attempt to grab on to God's goodness, God's peace, God's shalom? It's a Jenga tower waiting to fall, because all it takes is the slightest little nudge, just a little shake, just a little breeze blowing the wrong way. The more we scramble for control, the less shalom we experience. We want it to get it together, but things fall apart. So what's God's solution? What's God's solution? And by the way, with this idea of if I just perfectly organize everything, you've done that, and it's fallen apart, and your solution was, well, I just need to do it even more next time. We don't learn that lesson for some reason. But what's God's solution for shalom? Before 2024, before I was a kid, before the Scream, before Edward Munch, even before Jesus, there still existed anxiety and worry in this broad common sense. If you rewind 2,700 years, way back in the day, in the story of the Bible, there's these two nations that had once been one. It was Israel and Judah. Israel and Judah. I skipped a little bit ahead if you want to go ahead with me. Israel and Judah, they just couldn't figure it out. They couldn't get along. They separated into two different nations. On the horizon is this empire that is looking pretty scary, the Assyrian Empire. And they are breathing down everybody's necks. And people are worried. People are worried that they're just going to roll through and destroy everything. And so everybody's scrambling to organize a solution. How can we solve this problem? And so the smart people of the day offer three solutions. One is gather up all the other small nations and form an alliance. The theory is they can't take us all down. We'll fight off the big bad guy if all the little guys can band together. It's like if you get 100 fifth graders, maybe they can take down an adult. That's the theory behind that. The second theory that people had was just wave the white flag. Just open up the doors to the city and say, what's ours is yours. It just belongs to you. Just roll over and give up because you're going to lose anyway. At least this way you'll find them to be you'll make them more agreeable. And then the third solution was run to another major world superpower at the time, Egypt, and say, hey, we will pay tribute to you if you protect us. The problem is Egypt was just going to be as tyrannical as Syria was. And then there's this one voice, this one individual, this one prophet of God named Isaiah, and he is pleading with everybody to get back to your roots, and he's saying, I promise if you simply trust God, he will protect you. But the very real threat of the Assyrian nation, people are like, listen, that sounds great and all. That's good for a Sunday school lesson, but I don't know that we can actually do that as a political policy and live our kingdom that way. We can't do that. There's no way. It just cannot happen. This is what Isaiah says, Isaiah 26, wonderful passage. Verse 1, he says, in that day, he's projecting, he's prophesying. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. Remember, 2 nations, in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith. Look at verse 3. You will keep in perfect shalom. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself is the rock eternal. Such a good passage speaking into that anxiety. And it feels pretty relevant to people who pay attention to politics and get all excited about that. Stuff like this feels pretty relevant. We're like, oh, we got to figure out a geopolitical solution. We have to have the right person. We have to do the right things. We have to have the right policies. Otherwise, we're doom and destruction. And Isaiah is saying, hey, there's a better way to achieve that peace, and it is to trust God. The interesting tidbit about the phrase, perfect peace, is just shalom twice. He says, you will keep in shalom, shalom, those who trust in you. He says it twice to emphasize it, like we did in middle school where, oh yeah, I like her, but I don't like her. Right? This is what he's doing. It's emphasizing it. Shalom, shalom. It's real peace. It's not that rickety construction of organization peace that we sometimes want to compile together and hope that it works out for us. Isaiah says you cannot control your way to shalom. You, sitting here in the last day of June of 2024, cannot control your way to true, lasting peace. And some of you are right now on your phones trying to organize things just because you think that this is a way to do it. I will achieve perfect peace if I get everything scheduled and laid out just right. You cannot control your way to true shalom. Even today, the only way countries achieve peace is by having bigger and more weapons than the other guy. It's not peace. When we traveled with my family last summer to Dublin, we visited the Peace Walls. Have you ever heard of the Peace Walls during the Troubles? They built these walls to separate what was largely Protestant and Catholic parts of town, and they still call them peace walls. It wasn't peace. They kept having to build them higher because people were throwing things at each other over them, and now they're like 25, 30 feet high. It's not peace. And I thought, well, yeah, that happened back in the 80s and 90s. Nope, they still shut the doors at night today. Peace walls, that's not peace. That's not shalom. That's the kind of shalom that we can achieve if we build higher walls and bigger fences. That's all that we got. Isaiah says you can only trust your way to shalom. That's the only way to achieve true peace is to trust your way to it. So any guesses what the people in ancient Israel and Judah do? Any guesses? Those 2 nations. Nation number 1, Israel, which was to the north. They took the name Israel. They said, Isaiah, we hear you. We've thought about it, but we're going to form an alliance. And they did, and they got crushed by Assyria. Destroyed, carted off. That was it for them. everything, and this is interesting because Assyria just rolls through like a freight train and decimates everyone, even Egypt, who they were going to say, hey, you save us, Egypt. But Judah wasn't awesome. They weren't doing 100%, but every once in a while they'd have this little bright light, like maybe things are going to be okay. And Judah said, okay, we'll try God's way, at least this time. And I want you to check out this map this is from Wikipedia, and I'm telling you that because it's not like a spiritual source. But you notice the word Judah, and then just that little yellow. This is the Assyrian Empire. All this green is the Assyrian Empire. But there's this little blob of yellow, because the mightiest nation on earth tried to besiege Jerusalem, and they couldn't take it. Even according to non-Christian historians, they couldn't take it. Interesting. I wonder what the difference was between Israel and Judah. And then the problem was that just a few generations later, Judah had given back in to idolatry, and they were lost as well to another nation. God knew something that no one else knew. He knew that Assyria, the biggest, baddest nation the world had ever seen, they were one generation from death. They were almost done. They were almost out. It was a bunch of bluster. Their bark was way worse than their bite, and God knew that, and he said, if you hold on and trust me, that nation that you're so scared of, they are going away. And they did. They disappeared. Babylon came, destroyed them, and Assyria was gone to history as well. Within a generation. Within a generation, the biggest nation on earth was wiped off the map. How often are your worries and concerns and fears, how often do they just turn to nothing? You've spent days, weeks, months worrying about something, and then when it actually shows up, you're like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. That wasn't that big of a deal. How often does that happen? For you, for me, we're probably not so worried about the Assyrian Empire. But it's some big, bad, scary fear or uncertainty or insecurity. It's all those things life throws at us, right? That we've got to focus on and what's going to happen and how am I going to manage this? Let me give you just a little insight into the preacher world. I know this is not going to be relatable, so this is probably a terrible illustration. But every once in a while, I know this is going to come as a huge shock, I preach sermons that don't go well, that are 2 thumbs down, right? Now, when that happens, I've spent all week preparing a sermon, and, I get up here and present, and it just sometimes doesn't go well. Sometimes it is boring. Sometimes I don't say what I wanted to say. The words don't come out my mouth the way that I want them to come out of my mouth. It's just not very good. If I preach a sermon that's boring, you know what happens to you? You scroll on your phone a little bit, and then you leave and go get lunch somewhere. That's all. That's really all that happens, unless I'm preaching blasphemy or something. But you know what happens to me when I preach a bad sermon? Here's what happens to me. I preach a bad sermon, and by the way, I'm not very good at evaluating my own sermons. This is a little more insight than you really want. I always think they're bad. Isn't that weird? You're like, wait a second. I always think they're terrible. But when I preach a bad sermon, you go to lunch, and I go home, and I'm like, well, I guess that's it for my career. I thought I had something going. I've been doing it, 2+ decades, but that was it. I guess I've got to try something else. Like, what other jobs are out there for a guy who doesn't have any skills but working at a church? Or sometimes I think, man, there was a visitor, and they're never going to come back because it was such a terrible sermon. They were like, everything about church was awesome. People were friendly. The songs were great. Everything was wonderful, but he was throwing pickleballs around on stage. I'm never going back to that church. That's what I do. So I typically have 3 options when I preach a bad sermon. One is despair. You're like, that's a little drastic. I'm telling you. Despair, my career's over. When I despair, I always get stressed. Always results in stress. Option number 2 is control. I'm like, okay, I'll start working on next Sunday's sermon Sunday afternoon. Forget lunch, forget the nap. Dig in, make it better, work harder, organize more, study more, do more, come up with the best illustration, be awesome. You know what that does? Stress. And then by Thursday, I'm like, oh, it's not working anyway. Or the third thing I like to do when a sermon isn't going well is I kind of ignore it. And I don't mean ignore it like, who cares? I mean just like, well, procrastinate, distract myself, think about other things, or try to find a worse preacher online and watch them and say, at least I'm not them. I try to ignore it, but you know what happens if I ignore it? Stress. All my options to find some sort of peace produce more stress. Isn't that weird? Produce more stress. I have never once worried my way to a better outcome. Never once in my life. And I do it all the time. You'd think I'd be good at it by now. And I think that's because this is true. You cannot worry your way to peace. You cannot worry your way to peace. And some of you are like, yeah, I know, but I'm going to do it anyway. Here's what does work for me. Because you're like, you got to figure something out. If you think every sermon's bad, you got to figure it out, Patrick, because otherwise you're just walking around like a big dork, depressed all the time, and I'm not, so I figured something out. Here's what does work for me, is I take that fear, that concern, that uncertainty, and I let it surface, and I look at it, and I say, I name it. That thing that I'm just like, what is going to happen? So am I a good mom? Am I a good dad? Am I a good leader? Am I going to be okay? Is that just a headache from dehydration, or do I need to go get an MRI? You take that fear and that uncertainty and you let it surface and you look at it. It's okay to acknowledge it and talk about it and think about it. But then this is what we do. This is what Jesus said to do back in the book of Matthew. Then we say, you know what, God, I am not capable of handling this. Will you please take it? Will you handle it for me? You bat it away. God, I'm not capable of writing a great sermon on my own. Will your Spirit fill me? Will you give me your thoughts and your words and your truth? And will you let me rest in peace if I don't think that it went well, that you have given me the affirmation, the acknowledgement that I need just to be continuing to be your servant and to do your will? Because what we're told to do by Jesus is that thing coming at us, we're not supposed to take it up. Let God handle it. We're supposed to focus on that one thing. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these other things, hey, they will be added to you. But seek first the kingdom. And you've heard that. Some of you have grown up in church. You've heard that all your lives. You're like, I know. I'm still not going to do it. Why? You've given your way a chance your entire life. Why not give God's way a chance? Just to focus fully on what God is calling you to do. Notice the contrast between worry. And again, I can't emphasize enough that having a diagnosis of anxiety is an important thing, and people need to go find true, real medical professional help. But for a lot of us, it's just the uncertainties of life. We don't know what to do with them, and we're not sure how to think about them. Matthew 6:32, the pagans run after these things. Your heavenly Father knows that you need them. He knows already. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and these things will be provided to you. The truth is, it's always been, for the last however many years the earth has been here, humans have been living in an age of anxiety because a lot of it we create ourselves. You will never run out of things to worry about. But for thousands of years, God's solution has been the same. Back when Jesus said, seek first the kingdom, or way back when Isaiah told that anxious nation to trust in God. Isaiah 26. And we're going to wrap up with this verse. Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3. In fact, I'm going to have the praise team come up. Watch out for all these. Don't trip. See, I'm worried about you guys tripping, isn't that? Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 3. Spoke it into existence. Isaiah 26, verse 3. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. So, church, this is our chance to do what we probably haven't done most of our lives, is to let those other things go, to let God take care of them, and to focus on the one thing that he's given us to focus on. Let's stand and let's sing together.